Janice. We are in 10th week of the course, and in today's video we will be discussing the 44th lecture on the interpretation methods when it comes to an environmental measure being challenged in an investment dispute. So, firstly, in this particular video we will generally look at how the interpretation goes in an interpretation of an international investment agreement course, and in the next video we could probably look at the principle of systemic interpretation, and then finally we will conclude the video with certain other scholarly debates on the interpretation method. So, to begin with, how do arbitral tribunal interpret an IAA? We can see that the arbitral tribunals have been excessively relying on Vienna Convention on the law of treaties. I mean, there is no particular multilateral treaty that sort of talks about what should be the structure of a treaty. So, therefore, the interpretation depends on the content of the treaty. Even VCLT, Vienna Convention, the law of the treaties, merely state that the treaty should be in writing and that does not prescribe anything else. So, therefore, there is a huge weightage that is given to the language of the treaty itself when it comes to interpretation. Ordinarily, when an arbitral tribunal has to look at a provision of a bilateral investment treaty, it gives meaning to it looks at the ordinary meaning of the language of that particular provision, and that is how accordingly it applies that provision to the facts of the case and then arrives at a decision. So, this is what is ordinarily done, but also sometimes the tribunal, this is probably we can say is the first method of interpretation, but also sometimes the tribunal do look at go beyond the ordinary meaning. It also looks at the negotiating history as well, and then we could see that the object and the purpose of the treaty, then the negotiating history, then the context, all of them are also given weightage. So, primarily what we see here is the ordinary meaning of the provision is given lot of weightage, and then we also look at the negotiating history pursuant to Article 32 of Vienna Convention Law of Treaties. If you look at Article 32, which talks about supplementary means of interpretation, then we do see that negotiating history is also given some sort of a weightage. In fact, this is something that we can see in Methanex versus United States of America. In this particular case, when Methanex had requested for negotiating history of NAFTA, we could see that the tribunal stated that it will not order the United States to hand over the negotiating history, but instead of this decision by the tribunal, still we could see the Free Trade Commission had released the negotiating history of NAFTA to the public when the case was pending. I mean, at the time when the Methanex case was going on, that is when the entire negotiating history of NAFTA was released to the public. So, now the negotiating history is also a significant factor or a significant aid for interpreting an investment agreement. So, that is one of the things that the tribunal considers. So, what are the other things that a tribunal consider? We can also see that the tribunal also looks at the intention of the negotiators, which it takes from the negotiating history. Now, this is problematic for two reasons. One, it is not always easy to get the intention of the negotiator. Like we have seen in Methanex, the accessibility to negotiating history was something that was not readily available. So, that was one. And secondly, even if it was readily available, the relevance of the intention at the time of negotiation is questionable, because if it is sort of evolutionary in nature, so in that particular point of time, why should lot of emphasis should be given to the initial intention at the time of negotiation. So, that also convolutes the matter, but pursuant to Article 32 of Vienna Convention Law of Treaties, negotiating history is also a supplementary aid. So, what is the primary aid? Then we look at Article 31 of Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. So, Vienna Convention sort of lays down in 3 paragraphs as to what would be the primary thing that the tribunal would look at. So, primarily the tribunal should interpret the treaty provision in good faith, and it should give emphasis to the ordinary meaning of the provision itself, and it should not read it in isolation but in context in the light of object and purpose of the treaty. So, this is the guidance that the arbitral tribunal gets from VCLT, and we do see so many arbitral tribunals giving reference to the VCLT article 31 in most of the awards. So, therefore, VCLT article 31 takes a center stage when it comes to interpretation of an IAA provision. So, that is there. Now, is there any other instrument that sort of that can be relied on by the arbitral tribunals other than VCLT, especially in the context of interpretation? I do not see any other instrument. Even if we look at ICSID convention, so those again only deals with the procedural aspects of investment dispute, and therefore you don't see an aid to interpretation in any other instrument. So, VCLT do take a center stage. So, in the context of there are many elements that are mentioned in article 31 paragraph 1. So, what should be the weightage that is given? For example, we see the criteria or the factor of good faith, ordinary meaning, context, object and purpose of the treaty, all of these things. So, what should be the weightage that should be given to either of these factors or to all of these factors? So, that still remains a question. If we look at Feldman case, in Feldman case the tribunal was confronted with the question whether the PR of Mexico and a citizen of US, can he be considered to be an investor, and that particular point of time it looked at the provision of NAFTA, which stated that an investor can be either a citizen or a permanent resident. So, when the NAFTA provision says that citizen or permanent resident. So, the argument that Mexico was taking was, since he had permanent resident of Mexico, he cannot file a case against the host state because he is a permanent resident of Mexico. So, when the tribunal was confronted with that question, the tribunal gave emphasis to the criteria or the factor of object and purpose of the treaty, and then it adopted a purposive interpretation and stated that since the purpose of the treaty is to broaden the scope of the class of person who can file a case against the host state, and therefore that is why the NAFTA provision was drafted in such a way that either a citizen or a permanent resident can file a case. So, by interpreting this provision in the light of the object and purpose of the treaty, the tribunal arrived at the conclusion it would mean that either a US citizen or somebody who was a permanent resident of US could file a case against Mexico, and then ruled that Feldman can bring a case against Mexico. So, we do see that in Feldman case, one particular factor in article 31.1 was given lot of weightage. Then if we look at TechMed case also, we could see the TechMed tribunal had given weightage to the good faith aspect of article 31, and then it ruled that that is violated with Mexico's conduct. So, we do see that the tribunal has been choosing one or the other factor while arriving at a conclusion. But a better clarity can be seen with regard to this particular question in the context of ADT versus Bolivia. If we look at ADT versus Bolivia, so here the ADT tribunal has actually explained how article 31 of VCLT would be applicable on the facts at hand. So, in this particular case also the ADT tribunal had to interpret Bolivia Netherlands BIT, especially with regard to the question of legal control, direct or indirect, in order to arrive at the question of investor. So, when one particular phrase of Netherlands Bolivia BIT had to be interpreted, then we can see ADT tribunal looked at all the factors. It looked at the ordinary meaning, it looked at the context, it looked at the object and purpose of the treaty. So, that sort of gives a clarity, but it is, I mean, I can safely say that the tribunals are uncertain with regard to what should be the weightage given to the factor, and to what is the factor that has to be considered, or what are the factors that the tribunal will look at even from article 31.1. That is still there is no clarity on this particular question. So, with that we will in the next video look at how article 31.3 C, especially the C paragraph of 31.3, that could be relevant for reviewing a regulatory measure or any environmental measure taken by the host state. So, we will discuss that in detail in the next video. Thank you.